Ongoing relative tariff differential.
The question is that new Clause 1 be read a second time. John Penrose.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I wish to move the amendments that stand in my name along with a variety of other Conservative colleagues, including 2 members of the Select Committee, plus various former ministers and cabinet ministers, amongst others. I should pause and say that I am not arguing against the bill overall. I spoke and voted in favour of it in principle at second reading, and I hope everyone who's been involved in the campaign which I've been heading in this area for the last year and a half would appreciate that I believe the energy price cap is much needed. I'd also like to pay tribute to the 214 cross-party MPs who signed up in favour of the idea, plus the Prime Minister and the Minister, who have all been vital in getting us here today. So my concern isn't about the principles, it's about the detail, the type of price cap which the bill envisages. Because, to put it bluntly, a fair number of free market Tories are pretty concerned that we are choosing the most anti-competitive, complicated, bureaucratic and inflexible kind of cap on offer. Inflexible because the bill specifies an absolute cap which will be set by an all-knowing committee of Ofgem regulators every few months. But the international price of energy moves around every day. It's impossible to know what the price will be in the next 6 minutes, let alone 6 months. So the price cap will be out of date in moments, and it will stay out of date until it's reset again months later. That means it won't protect customers in the way we all want, and, because it's officially blessed by Ofgem, will embed and legitimise high prices too. And it isn't just me who's worried. Which says it's not certain that customers on a capped default tariff will benefit as market conditions change in future. And the proposed cap is complicated, hideously complicated. Why? Well, because the assiduous folk at Ofgem have already started publishing details of how they might go ahead, and, Madam Deputy Speaker, they are warming to their task. So it wouldn't just be a single cap, they say. It would be 42 different ones to cover gas and electricity, different meter types, different parts of the country. But it would be more than 42 different caps, because each one may be split into several different versions, depending on whether you pay by direct debit or some other way. Each one will have a fixed standing charge and a variable element. Oh, and headroom too. And each of those 3 items can be calculated in a marvellously technical and complicated variety of ways. For example, the variable element could use a basket of market tariffs, or an updated competitive reference price, or a bottom-up cost assessment. And those things might be calculated using a periodic review of realised costs or third-party data within pre-specified allowances for certain cost items, and so on, and turgidly, complicatedly on. And on that note, I will gladly give way.
I'm very grateful, Honourable Friend, for giving way. And as he knows, we've had an engaging conversation about this for many months. Given all the things he reports about what Ofgem is planning, surely that means it won't be a single-point tariff which will be rapidly outdated, but rather will be one which will respond, for example, to input costs.
Madam Deputy, as he says, he and I have had, my right honourable friend and I have had many conversations about this over a period of many months. And I think all I can say to him is this. If the argument is that Ofgem might possibly come up with a version of an absolute cap which is a bit less absolute and a bit closer to what I'm proposing, which is effectively to cap the gap, a relative cap, and that therefore is a good thing, then yes, I'd agree with him, it would be a good thing, but why, if that is a good thing, isn't it even better to go the whole hog and actually just have a relative cap in the first place, if that is a source of advantage for the cap itself? I'm happy to.
Does he think that the relative cap would be more likely to deliver a better deal for the customer than the absolute cap?
Deputy Speaker, yes, absolutely. We've already heard, actually, I thought rather a good explanation about why it was so wonderful from the Labour front bench. They disagree as to its purpose, but I think that the reason why we are all here is fundamentally because the injustice in the way that the energy market works at the moment is because people can start off on one tariff and can get secretively pushed up onto a much higher one. It is that pushing up, is that markup, that clandestine approach markup, which is the thing which gets everybody riled up. It's what really upsets people, and therefore a relative cap, by definition, affects the thing which is hacking everybody off about this and is precisely targeted at dealing with the mischief which is behind this bill in the first place.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I just wanted to put it to our right honourable friend. Actually, it was something that the money-saving expert said, which is that a relative cap would simply result in firms withdrawing the cheapest deals. I think it was referred to by the shadow member over there, and it would create the worst of both worlds, and we don't want to fall into that trap. Some consumers would still be paying more than they need to on expensive tariffs, while many firms would not offer the cheap deals that they currently do.
Madam Deputy Speaker, that argument has been advanced for both a relative cap and an absolute cap. There are people who would argue that it applies in both cases. And we've just heard, I think, earlier on, rather a good explanation about why the argument doesn't really apply, because it would be, I think the phrase was, commercial suicide or commercial kamikaze effort for anybody to try and raise their prices in the switching market, which is highly competitive, because they would start losing customers very rapidly, hand over fist. So I understand the argument, but I don't think it would work. It would be relevant in practice. I'll happily give way.
Just to underline the delicate nature of the balance that we're talking about in terms of caps, the majority view of the CMA in their report was, in fact, if I might quote, was that a standard variable tariff cap would run excessive risks of undermining the competitive process, likely resulting in worse outcomes for consumers in the long run by potentially reducing the incentives of suppliers to compete and reducing the incentives of consumers to engage. And so there is a delicate balance here which needs to be struck.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think that's absolutely bang on the money, and for goodness sake, if the Competition and Markets Authority would suggest it, that is, after all, their business in the first place. But one more, and then I must make some progress.
The honourable gentleman was talking about when people move from a competitive rate to the default rate, which he describes as the standard variable tariff. Does he think that people would be less inclined to put up with that higher rate if it had an alternative name, such as, for example, an emergency tariff?
Madam Deputy Speaker, there are a whole range of underlying reforms which actually, I'm not normally one to give Ofgem a vast amount of credit, but in this case they really do deserve some. There are a whole range of underlying pro-competitive reforms which are needed in this market. Renaming the default tariff or the standard variable tariff may not have a huge effect, but it might have a positive effect, and there are a series of other things, perhaps some of them even more important than that, which also need to happen. And the crucial thing, and here I think I'd agree with the Labour front bench as well, and I think everybody would agree with this, the crucial thing is that while this temporary price cap is in effect, we must not waste our time, and Ofgem must continue to reform this market, because when the price cap comes off, we want the market to have been reformed enough that no further price caps are going to be necessary, because it works like a normal market where the customer is king. If we haven't done that, then we've wasted our time and everybody else's as well. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, I was talking about complications and the hideous complexity of the proposals from Ofgem. But if all that inflexibility and complexity hasn't put you off already, have a look at the bureaucracy as well. Pretty much every free market economist will agree that the best way to discover a price isn't a committee that meets every couple of months. It's a genuinely competitive market where supply and demand are matched from moment to moment, every day, all day. And fortunately, we just happen to have one of those handy. The switching market is full of deals where energy firms compete like mad for business. It's innovative. It has razor-sharp prices. It takes changes in wholesale energy costs in its stride every day of every week. The customer is, in other words, genuinely king or queen. And it's exactly what we want to see in the rest of the market, as we've just been discussing. So why are we ignoring it? Why go for this far less competitive, inflexible, hideously complicated, bureaucratic committee-based version when we could simply tie the rip-off default tariffs firmly to the switching market and go down the pub for a drink? The mechanism, as we've heard, would be simplicity itself, a maximum markup between each energy firm's best competitive price and their default tariff. Cap the gap. Unlike the version of the bill, there'd be just one decision for regulators to take: the size of the gap. Everything else will be taken care of by the link to the competitive switching market. Happily give way.
grateful to my neighbour for giving way. Has he given any thought to what a relative cap would do for time-of-use tariffs, which we must surely be encouraging their arrival, but rely on a big differential in price from free or negative pricing up to most expensive prices that disincentivise energy use at peak times? And is he concerned, as I am, that what he proposes might disincentivise the arrival of those tariffs?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I think that much would depend on the size of the cap on the gap which Ofgem was going to propose, and much would depend on the rest of the energy firm in question's pricing structure as to where they chose to put their default tariff. In many cases, what we're talking about with these things are, as he rightly points out, yet to arrive. And they are starting to be introduced, but there are many. But they are a new innovation, and they're relatively new, and their penetration is small but growing. And therefore, he's absolutely right that we would need to make sure that we weren't disincentivising those kinds of tariffs. They certainly won't be for everybody's taste, but they may be for an increasingly large number of people's case. But I'd rather start from a simple capping the gap, and have to make a couple of adjustments than something that's already hideously complicated, as I was already talking about, and then have to make it even more complicated as a result. So, if we've managed to take care of everything else, all the complexity, all the bureaucracy, by the link to the competitive switching market, then presto, we'd have driven a stake through the heart of the rip-off tariffs. And it would still be worthwhile to switch your supplier. And there would still be far fewer jobs for bureaucrats, lawyers and lobbyists. And the customer would be king. So, under the amendments I've tabled, a relative cap would either be possible or required, depending on which version is chosen. I'm not expecting or intending to press them to a vote, but I want everybody to realise that there is a more competitive, more flexible, less bureaucratic, more customer-friendly, just generally better alternative, and that at the moment we aren't taking it. And it isn't just free market Tories like myself who think that capping the gap is the right way to go. The Labour front bench, as we've just heard, have tabled an amendment proposing one too. I think they might disagree with the way I'm describing it. They've got a fancy-schmancy name for it instead. But broadly speaking, as my right honourable friend from Dorset pointed out earlier on, the wording is very, very similar, where they are effectively doing the same thing. So we disagree, the Labour front bench and my amendments. We disagree over timing. Their amendment would be permanent, whereas ours is temporary, while we fix the market's underlying anti-competitive problems. But there is nonetheless a clear cross-party consensus over the principle at the very least. So why does the bill ignore this cross-party opportunity? And why is a notionally pro-competition Conservative government choosing the less competitive, more bureaucratically inflexible, complicated version instead? Why are we snatching defeat from the jaws of what ought to be a famous free market victory? I look forward to the Minister's answer.
Frank Field.
Madam Deputy Speaker,